Hey, U.S. history. So let's talk about the Cold War, which was voted number one in the last unit for the year. However, we are going to mix a couple things up just to have a little bit of fun. So we're not doing notes on this. We're not going to have a test on this. We're going to do something, but we're not going to have a test. And so we'll do a little bit of Cold War, a little bit of post-war America, Red Scare, espionage, communism, all that stuff. And then we'll end it with a little bit of Vietnam as well, because that was the second highest vote, and chapters are back to back, so we can pick and choose what we want to do. Okay? So, but, excuse me. First, let's talk about the Cold War. So the Cold War, on April 12th, 1945, let's back up a little bit and talk about how we get into the Cold War. So FDR died April 12th, 1945, and his vice president, Harry Truman, took the oath of office and became president. And he says, boys, if you ever pray for me now. The guy wasn't ready to be president. He wasn't prepared to be president. FDR had been president for 13 years. He wasn't planning on being president anytime soon. He also didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience and literally got thrown into the end of World War II. So whether or not he was prepared, he certainly did a lot of stuff. So let's talk about what happened at the end of World War II. One effort to make lasting world peace was to create the United Nations, which was kind of like the better version, the new and improved League of Nations, which of course the United States had not joined. So the United Nations was born out of the wartime cooperation among the Allies. So the UN began April 25th, 1945, which is actually technically before the end of World War II, with delegates in San Francisco from 50 different nations writing a charter. The United States Senate ratified the UN Charter in 1945 by an overwhelming margin, and eventually the UN decided to make its permanent home in New York City. The UN includes three major agencies. So you have the General Assembly, which has delegates from all member nations. They meet once a year, representatives from all the countries. They have a forum in which all member nations can express their views. The Security Council then is the second agency. That includes 5 permanent members: the U.S., Russia, Britain, France, and China. Okay, so let's write a little bit of this down. So, shall we? So the UN, one is General Assembly, and you have reps from all member nations. Then you have the Security Council, which is the US, Russia, Great Britain, France, China, and 10 members elected by the General Assembly for 2-year terms. Plus 10 elected. So it's a council of 15. And then lastly, you have the Secretariat, which is the bureaucracy and the center of administration. I think after 3 years of teaching history, I have finally figured out how to spell bureaucracy. This is a big moment, guys. Okay, so proponents of the United Nations hoped that the body would provide a forum for rational discussion as a means of furthering world peace. So, like, if we can talk about it, we don't have to fight about it. You know, the lecture they give you when you're 5 and you punch your friend in the face. They say, just talk about it, right? You don't have to punch him. Good intentions laid behind the founding of the United Nations. But as you know, we have had several wars since 1945, so clearly it hasn't been perfect. So let's talk about the Cold War and communism. The failures of the United Nations in the post-war era are highlighted by the struggle of the free world against the aggressive policies of the Soviet Union. Presidential advisor Bernard Baruch dubbed this hostility, he called it the Cold War, which has, of course, become what it's been known as. Now, why is it the Cold War? Because it's not a war. There weren't battles. Nobody went, well, I mean, there were, but that's different. We'll get to that in a minute. You don't have the United States and the Soviet Union facing each other on a field, firing at each other. So it's not a hot war. That would be actual military conflict. The Cold War is more of a period of tensions, hostility, things like that. And of course, they're actively working against each other constantly. Everybody's passing laws to stop one, stop the other, stuff like that. So the United States government did not grant diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union until 1933, even when fighting their common enemy, Hitler. Roosevelt and Stalin disagreed about a lot of things. What really launched into the Cold War, though, was the realization that the USSR intended to spread its dominion throughout the world as much as they could. Remember last chapter we learned about Stalin saying, World War II is an opportunity. Wherever I occupy, I'm keeping. The Cold War was waged around the world as the forces of democracy and the forces of communism squared off in nation after nation. Of course, they never squared off in Russia or the US, but they squared off in a lot of poor other nations that couldn't help themselves. So, really, you've got fronts in Eastern Europe, the Middle East and the Mediterranean, in Western Europe, in Asia. And so let's kind of go through what's happening in each of those locations. So in Eastern Europe, the first campaign of the Cold War takes place in Eastern Europe as the Soviets imposed pro-Soviet governments there. Okay? So let's make a big one. Cold War, Eastern Europe. All right. So, before World War II ended, the Soviet Union had already installed puppet governments in Poland and Romania. So, what's a puppet government? It means the country's technically independent, but they're not. They're controlled by the Soviet Union. Then, after 1945, East Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, Albania, and Yugoslavia all fall under communist control. East Germany. Okay, let's talk about that for a second. Why East Germany? So basically, after World War II, the Allies, so Russia, Soviet Union, Great Britain, the United States, and France, because after they liberated France, France became a participating member in all of the Allied endeavors. They looked and they said, okay, after World War I, we really messed up. We let Germany be on their own. Right now, we're not going to let them be on their own. So they split Germany up into 4 sections. And they basically said each one of those 4 nations, Soviet Union, United States, France, and Great Britain, are responsible for one of the sections of Germany. So here, let's say if Germany was a circle. It's not a circle, but I can't draw it. So then you have like the USSR took that point, the US, France, and Great Britain. They each had their own chunk. Okay? Berlin, the capital, is right there in the USSR section, but barely. So then what happens is the USSR says, cool, we're going to make our part communist. And the US and France and Great Britain said, wait, no, what? And the USSR says, yep, we're communist now. So it divides the country. And so for a long time, you actually have 2 countries with 2 separate governments because Great Britain, France, and the US were better at working together. And they also all wanted democracy. So you have 2 governments and you have 2 nations. So it splits into East Germany, which is that part, and West Germany, which is all the rest. So, anyways, East Germany. Russia doesn't only control East Germany, but they also control, like I said, Hungary, Bulgaria, Albania, Yugoslavia, Poland, and Romania. Czechoslovakia then, in 1948, was the last European country to succumb to Soviet conquest. All of this was contrary to the Soviet guarantees of Yalta, because at Yalta, the Soviets said, yes, we will, of course, encourage free democratic elections across all of these nations. Winston Churchill described it as an iron curtain. He said that a curtain is descending, dividing Eastern Europe from the rest of the world, and it's made of iron. So President Truman responded to the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe with a policy of containment. They don't want to launch into another world war. That didn't go well. I mean, they won, but a lot of people died. So Truman doesn't want to launch into another war. So he figures, okay, maybe if we can stop it from spreading any further, it'll be fine. So that's the policy of containment. West conceded the area to the Soviets. They said, you can have that. But further communist aggression would be resisted. If this sounds a lot like what they did with Hitler before World War II, it's because it is. But they called it containment instead of appeasement. Patterns. But then in 1945, the combative Truman, because Truman was not known for speaking nicely. He talked to the Soviet foreign minister, basically called him out. And Molotov says, I have never been talked to like that in my life. And Truman said, carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that. Oh snap, all that good stuff, comebacks. I imagine you're all reacting. I wish you were. I wish we were all in the classroom and you could all react and insult each other about this. But we're not. Here we are. So, Faced with growing communist menace, Truman was intent on pursuing the policy of containment by providing military and economic support to halt Soviet expansion. So this is where Truman differs from Hitler's plan, right? Truman says, we're not just going to give you that and hope you obey your promise. No, Truman is actively going to give money and military assistance to the other countries near the Iron Curtain so that communism is unable to spread further. The Soviets aren't able to expand more. Okay, so that's ultimately why it is containment instead of appeasement. So then we've got the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Middle East and Mediterranean. The policy of containment did achieve some success. In 1946, the Soviets withdrew their forces from Iran. More critically, the same year, civil war erupted in Greece, where communists tried to take over the country. The Soviet Union also pressures Turkey for territory and the right to establish naval bases on the Bosphorus. Of course, that's such a strategic waterway. I hope you know by now what Turkey looks like and what that, like, Constantinople, Istanbul, because it's called Istanbul by this point. It's the same city. Like, that's right on that major waterway that connects Asia to the Mediterranean. And so, ultimately speaking, like, Turkey has super important strategic resources, especially for the Soviets. And so there's a lot of pressure on Turkey. They want waterway providing access to the Black Sea, the Aegean Sea. To prevent the spread, though, Truman asked Congress for $400 million in economic aid for Greece and Turkey. This policy of aiding countries in fighting communist takeovers but not going to do it yourself became known as the Truman Doctrine. And both Greece and Turkey successfully warded off communist threats. Okay? Greece, Turkey, and, of course, the all-important Truman Doctrine. Now let's talk about Western Europe. So after 1945, American attention focuses mostly on Western Europe, obviously, because that's who you've been working with, France, Great Britain. And economic ruin from the war created an opportunity for communist advance. Because France had been so destroyed, they were worried that they would fall prey to communism. You actually, even, especially in France and Italy, they already have communist political parties in their country who are fighting for election. And of course, if they became elected, then they would become communist. And so to blunt the appeal of the Soviets, Secretary of State George Marshall in 1947 offered a plan for massive economic aid to all European countries. The Soviet Union and its puppet governments in Eastern Europe refused the aid, but Western Europe welcomed it. So they basically said, we will give money to every country in Europe. Of course, the countries controlled by the Soviets said no, because they didn't want Americans to have a foothold to progress their democratic agenda. But you do have this, and this is called the European Recovery Program, better known as the Marshall Plan. This is big deal in history. By 1951, the U.S. had spent $13 billion restoring the economies of other nations in Western Europe. The Marshall Plan not only further immunized the region against communism, but also restored the European countries as trading partners with the United States. So it did help out the U.S. First of all, it stopped the spread of communism, and second of all, it reestablished these nations as very important trading partners, which boosts the United States economy. So reacting to the Soviet military threat in the West, though, the Western nations forged a military alliance to defend themselves. This is known as, in April 1949, representatives from 10 Western European countries, the United States and Canada, formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Still exists today. The U.S. Senate overwhelmingly ratifies this. And in 1945, the communist countries of Eastern Europe reacted by creating the Warsaw Pact, which was basically their version of NATO. Warsaw, of course, being the capital of Poland. Warsaw Pact. Okay. The division of Germany after the war into communist East Germany and Allied control West Germany also creates tensions. Naturally, you're both running half of the country. In 1948, the Americans, British, and the French consolidated their occupation zones into Western Germany, so they worked together, and they began the process of forming a government. Threatened by the prospect of a unified West Germany, the Soviets blockaded West Berlin. So they basically took the capital city, split it down the middle, built a wall in West Berlin, and said, okay, you own West Berlin and you own West Germany. Like, the only way to get from one to the other is by air. You cannot walk. So let's go back to our map. I'm going to draw a map of Germany a little bit bigger so you can get an idea. So this is east, this is west, this is Berlin. Berlin is not actually that big, but I want you to be able to see it. So the Soviets build a wall right there. and they build a wall right there. Eventually, spoiler alert. So west, east, and this is West Berlin. So this bit of Berlin is occupied and run by the same people that run this part of the nation. But you can't walk that. That's blocked off. The Soviets blockaded it and said you can't get from there to there. So basically, imagine like if Canada was a hostile nation, but Washington, D.C. was located in Canada. You can fly to Washington, D.C., but you can't drive or walk. Okay? So they've been blockaded, surrounded by the communist East. Obviously, West Berlin is feeling incredibly vulnerable at this point. And by cutting off all access to West Berlin, Stalin hoped to take over all of Berlin. But Truman responded with what is known as the Berlin Airlift, which is this massive airlift of food and supplies to Western Berlin. And by May 1949, the Berlin Airlift forced the Soviet Union to end the blockade. Afterwards, the Soviets reacted to the formation of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, by fashioning Eastern Germany into a communist state, the German Democratic Republic. Obviously, it's not a republic. But Germany remains divided until 1990. 1990, you have two German nations, two German governments. So, let's talk about the year of shocks. Man, this is a doozy of a section. It's interesting, though. Okay, so for the free world, 1949 was a year of shocks. Since the 1920s, China has been engaged in civil war as well, between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong, who, if you've heard of, there's a reason. So World War II interrupts their fighting because they were both fighting the Japanese, but after 1945, civil war resumes. So they were civil war. Oh, United World War, civil war. The United States supported the nationalists with $2 billion in aid, but it wasn't enough. In 1949, communist forces gained control of mainland China. Nationalist forces had to flee to the island of Taiwan off the coast of China, and there they set up their government. And Taiwan still is a free trade partner. The United States continued to recognize the nationalists in Taiwan as the real China in the UN, so the representatives in the UN from China were actually from Taiwan. Only in the 1970s did U.S. officially recognize the government of Mao on the mainland. So it took until the 1970s before mainland China was an officially recognized government by the UN and by the U.S. The existence of nuclear weapons then... Okay, so let's say this wasn't all enough. Now remember that we have nukes now, okay? So in 1949, 4 years after the atomic bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviets detonate their first atomic bomb and force Truman to reevaluate America's defense policy. So he says, oh crap. And America's nuclear threat now carried less of a punch because the Soviets had the same bomb. So what do? They make a bigger bomb. This is where Truman coins the hydrogen bomb, which has a blast 100 times greater than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1952. He also, of course, escalates conventional military forces, so he builds up the army a bit more. Within a year, though, the Soviet Union has their own hydrogen bomb. So now you have this arms race. Who can make the bigger bomb first? And will we use them? Keep in mind, 100 times more. So the atomic bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki desiccated an entire city in one blast. And the hydrogen bomb's more powerful. Nobody wants this to be used at all. But you need to have it, because if you don't have it, then they can use theirs with no threat of retaliation. So we need to have a bomb so that they don't use their bomb, so that we don't have to use our bomb. That's the Cold War. All right, now let's talk about the Korean War. You might be saying, wait a second, Ms. Sullivan, we didn't finish the Cold War. Why are we talking about the Korean War? Because the Korean War is, oh dear, I just threw my marker. The Korean War is the Cold War. Okay, they are the same thing. The most serious military conflict of the early Cold War occurred in Asia on the Korean Peninsula. Freed from Japanese control after World War II, Korea had become divided along the 38th parallel, which is a line of latitude, into the communist North Korea and non-communist South Korea. The communists, though, had promised to, of course, engage in free elections that would unite the country, and they refused. And on June 25th, 1950, the North invades the South in an attempt to unite the country, but under communist rule. Okay? So 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. The communists, so basically, President Truman, rather than asks Congress for a declaration of war, worked through the Security Council of the United Nations in responding. The USSR could have vetoed, but they were actually absent. So keep in mind, in the Security Council, Russia could veto things that were happening, but Russia wasn't at that meeting because they were mad that the United States wouldn't recognize China as an official country, and so they were boycotting the meeting, and so they couldn't veto, and so actually the UN, which Russia's on, was giving aid to South Korea to fight North Korea, who Russia was helping. Good times. So, President Truman is working through the UN. The USSR was not able to veto it, and 14 other nations sent troops, but the US contributed the most men. They also contributed to General Douglas MacArthur, who you might remember is one of the heroes from World War II, specifically in the Pacific. So he's leading the UN forces that are there to help South Korea. The theory is if we go fight, then North Korea will stop, and at least South Korea won't be contaminated by communism. Initially, the North Koreans penetrated very, very deeply into South Korea, brushing aside both the disorganized South Korean resistance and the first American unit sent to Korea. MacArthur, however, reversed the situation. He took advantage of his air power and his naval power, both of which were superior, and launched an amphibious invasion behind the North Korean lines at a place called Incheon, a seaport halfway up the western coast. In one magnificent stroke, he manages to cut off the North Korean supply lines and begin destroying the North Korean force. Soon the UN forces push the communists back to the 38th parallel. And then they want to keep going because now they're the ones that want to invade North Korea to force them to be united under the non-communist government. So the first part of the Korean War is North Korea invading. And then you have fight back to where we were. Now the South Koreans invade North Korea because they want to unite all of Korea under a democratic regime. But MacArthur's success had an unexpected effect because now you have somebody else involved. China, and mainland China is communist. And so they sent thousands of troops into North Korea to rescue the North's communist government. So basically China did what the UN did. Oh, you're being invaded? Let's help. The Chinese sent the UN forces reeling back down. MacArthur had downplayed the possibilities of Chinese intervention and now said, uh-oh, we face an entirely new war. Communist forces pushed the UN troops back to the 38th parallel, which is where it all started. Soon you have a replay of the trench warfare that devastated World War I, right on the 38th parallel. Two well-entrenched sides fighting each other desperately for a few square miles of completely worthless land. They were back to where they started. MacArthur declared there is no substitute for victory. He said, we can't just leave it at a truce. We have to completely win. And he argued for breaking the stalemate by expanding war into China. But Truman said, no, we want to do limited war. We want a limited objective. We got them out of South Korea, and that's what we wanted to do. Truman refused to expand the conflict because he didn't want to risk a third world war, which probably would have happened. MacArthur disagreed publicly, and Truman relieved him of command, which is military talk, for fired him. Truce talks began in July 1951. Fighting continued for 2 more years, though, that trench warfare where nobody really won anything, until a truce was reached on July 27, 1953. So the truce was reached in 1953, but there wasn't a treaty or anything made. So a lot of people argue that the Korean War didn't really end until actually a year ago. So 33,000 Americans died in a war that left the boundary between North Korea where it was before the war began, which some people would argue was a victory because they wanted to stop North Korea from taking over South Korea. And if there hadn't been U.S. intervention, that very likely would have happened. That being said, though, it's very hard to justify a war where you didn't win, right? So now let's talk about how to accommodate communism. So now we get to 1952. It's a presidential election year, and Truman says, I'm not going to run again. The Korean War was very unpopular, and so he wouldn't have won anyways. But you have a new guy, Dwight Eisenhower, was elected president and served 2 terms. You may remember him as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe in World War II. He was then followed by John Kennedy. Eisenhower and Kennedy gave containment kind of a twist. They were more willing to allow the existence of communism. They called it peaceful coexistence. So that was the phrase coined to describe the goal. They wanted them to be able to work together, okay? the United States was changing its goal from pursuit of total victory into just kind of live and let live. Like, if you don't make a nuisance out of yourself, then we won't fight you type situation. But you have a couple problems. One of them is Indochina. France controlled Indochina from the middle of the 19th century until Japan captured it after World War II. After the war, France attempted to reclaim its former colony. Communists in Vietnam, which is the largest part of Indochina — note, Indochina is not China, different places. Communists in Vietnam played on anti-French sentiment to form a revolution. The communist leader, Ho Chi Minh, successfully conducted a guerrilla war against the French, which climaxed in 1954 with the defeat of the French at a battle of Dien Bien Phu. So now you have the Vietnamese fighting against the French. Now you could argue that this is kind of like a revolution because the French were in control of them and they wanted their independence. Of course, they're fighting for communism, so different people disagree on whether or not that negated their right to independence. In 1954, an international conference at Geneva divided Vietnam between the communist North and the French South. Does it sound familiar? If it sounds like Korea, you are correct. So the United States did not sign the Geneva Agreement, but they did continue to aid South Vietnam under its anti-communist president after the French withdrew. In short, the U.S. was willing to tolerate the existence of the communist North, but they wanted to help the communist South, or the non-communist South, stay non-communist. Eisenhower sent 2,000 military advisors to aid in training and organizing forces, and his rationale was the domino theory. If one non-communist nation fell, then other nations would fall too, like dominoes. President Kennedy boosted the American commitment, but the situation in Vietnam did not improve. A coup in 1963 overthrew and murdered the non-communist leader, and the communist guerrilla war intensified. The stage was set for massive military intervention in South Vietnam under Johnson, and Vietnam soon replaced Korea as the Cold War's hottest conflict. But we will talk about that tomorrow, the next day, one of those 2 days. Thursday. We will talk about it on Thursday. So, Vietnam, Indochina, you have a lot of communist warfare going on constantly. Okay? So yes, no, there's no official declaration of war, but there is fighting. Then you have Cuba. In Cuba, as in Vietnam, America accommodated the further spread in violation of the spirit of containment. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the Cuban dictator, but instead of installing a democracy, created a communist state that was just 90 miles away from America. He nationalized foreign-owned property, signed a trade agreement with the Soviet Union. Of course, President Eisenhower has to respond, so he responds with trade sanctions. He breaks diplomatic relations, says we're not going to trade with Cuba anymore, and authorized the CIA to plan a counterattack to topple Castro. So he actually authorizes the CIA to plan a United States-led coup to get rid of the dictator in Cuba, which you could argue is constitutional, not constitutional, within our rights, not within our rights. The CIA project culminates during the Kennedy administration, when Cuban exiles, assisted by the CIA, invaded their own homeland on April 16th, 1961. This is the Bay of Pigs invasion. And the operation ended in total failure after 3 days of struggle because the U.S. aid was withdrawn at the last minute. An embarrassed John Kennedy was philosophical. He said, "Victory is 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan." So they launched this invasion, but then they are unable to, they withdraw some of their help at the last minute, and it completely fails. The most dramatic confrontation over Cuba didn't come, though, until October 1962. And this is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest the world has ever come to total nuclear war. And your book gives it like 4 sentences. So we're just going to talk about this for 1 minute. I know this lesson is getting long, but there's a lot going on. Like, holy cow, I didn't realize there was this much in this section. Okay, so American intelligence confirms the existence of nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. And so the Soviets interpreted Kennedy's refusal to use enough military force as a sign of weakness. They said, okay, well, if the Americans haven't toppled Castro, then they're clearly weak. So what if we set up a nuclear launch site in Cuba, which is really close? So at this point in the 1960s, the Russians can't launch a nuclear warhead from Russia, at least not from Moscow, and hit the United States. It's too far away. But if they set up a nuclear missile base in Cuba, for example, that could work. And so Kennedy finds out that they're building these nuclear warheads, and he says, no. Okay, hold on. I'm going to blockade Cuba, and you are not able to get to them. Blockading, so he was going to send the Navy to stop Russia from reaching Cuba. This could be seen as a declaration of war. If it was seen as a declaration of war, the Soviets could nuke the U.S. This is a very, very tense tense week. There's a really, really, really good movie about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think it's rated R, so ask your parents before you watch it. But it's, I don't remember what it's called, 13 Days or something like that. But it is a phenomenally done movie. And this becomes known as the Cuban Missile Crisis because Kennedy orders this blockade, and it's a crisis because if the Soviets had interpreted it as a declaration of war, they would have nuked the U.S. And so the U.S. had decided, do we nuke first? If the U.S. had nuked first, that absolutely would have been a declaration of war. And so eventually, though shortly thereafter, the Soviet Premier Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in return for a pledge by the U.S. not to invade Cuba. Kennedy accepted the proposal, and the crisis is averted. When he learned, though, that the Soviets had chosen to honor the blockade, the Secretary of State basically said, we're in a staring contest, and they just blinked. Most Americans viewed the crisis as an American triumph, but what the public did not know was Kennedy also agreed to remove some missiles from Turkey in exchange for Soviet concession. The president was willing to tolerate the communist foothold in pursuit of the bigger idea of not doing a civil war. So, just as Cuba was an insult to American pride, another one is West Berlin. But West Berlin is an embarrassment to the communists because they have a non-communist capital literally right in the middle of their nation. It was a showcase of democracy. It was a haven for refugees. If you could make it into West Berlin from East Germany, you were free. Khrushchev met with Kennedy in Vienna and threatened to restrict Western access to Berlin in 1961. In response, Kennedy said, no, we are going to increase our defense spending. Of course, the U.S., or the Soviets don't like that, and they end up constructing the Berlin Wall, which is the wall between East and West Germany and between East and West Berlin specifically. The wall goes up almost overnight, and it's a militarized zone where there's barbed wire and dogs and guard towers that are trying to stop refugees from escaping East Berlin into West Berlin, and lots of people died trying to cross it. There's actually a piece of it in the behind the Hard Rock Cafe at Universal if you're interested in seeing it. Actually, for extra credit, send me a picture of a portion of the Berlin Wall and tell me the difference between how the Berlin Wall looked on the East German side and on the West German side. Okay? So the wall solved the East German refugee problem, but it did demonstrate the failure of communism as the Second Berlin Crisis of the Cold War ends. So that was a lot. I just talked for half an hour. Sorry, guys. I didn't mean to make it that long. But I hope that was interesting for you. If you're following along here, but man, there's so much in here. Like, the Cold War was really, really crazy because it was a war, but it wasn't a war. And they were going to kill each other, but they're not going to kill each other. And holy cow. Okay, so after all that, I hope you enjoyed. I'm going to send out another video on domestic reform, and then we'll do Vietnam, and that'll be the end. Okay, so good stuff. Thanks for hanging in there, you guys, and I will see you soon. I miss you guys. I hope you're doing well, and I will talk to you later. Cool. Yeah, the end. Okay, bye.